Chapter 731. Eugene took a deep breath. It was not optimum for him to make any move rashly now that Helios was present. I'm not looking to cause them any troubles. Then why did you bring these people here? Francisco pointed at the bodyguards. What are you bastards doing? You better take your hands off him. None of you is allowed to make a move on anyone in this room. The bodyguards looked at Eugene with embarrassed expressions. Eugene then waved his hands impatiently, motioning them to step back. Eugene glared at Francisco. And his expression looked gloomy. You're coming back with me. Francisco crossed his arms as if he was about to lodge a complaint about his father's doing. I'll definitely go with you. I'm going to tell grandfather everything that just happened. Francisco ignored him and walked to Helios's side. Bro, I'll leave my mother to you. Helios nodded. Francisco then looked back at Maisie and waved at her with a grin when he walked to the door. Little goddess. Remember to invite me when you want to buy someone a meal again in the future. Maisie lowered her head and could not help but want to laugh. Eugene left with his men. Maisie walked up to Kennedy. Uncle Kennedy, are you all right? Kennedy smiled. I'm fine. He didn't hurt me. Samantha heaved a sigh of relief and looked at them. I'm sorry, everything is a mess now because of me. Maisie waved at her. That's not true. That wasn't your fault at all. Helios took a glance at Maisie and then said to Samantha, Aunt Samantha. I'll fetch you back first. Samantha nodded. She could only leave with Helios as she was severely shocked by the commotion that Eugene had just created. Maisie and Kennedy were walking out of the private room when he asked. Are you the one who called Mr. Helios Boucher over? Maisie shook her head. No, I only informed Francisco about the meal. Francisco should be the one who called Helios along because he thought he might not be able to handle the situation alone. Thank God Helios came. After all, even if Francisco is Eugene's biological son, Eugene might not even care about what his son thinks. But Helios' status in the Bouchers makes him different. Maisie's eyes lit up as she thought of something and said, Auntie Samantha is so pitiful. Her divorce application has been granted. But her ex-husband still treats her like trash. Kennedy did not say anything while Maisie uttered a pregnant statement. Auntie Samantha has a great temperament while being gentle and kind at the same time. Mr. Eugene Boucher is not only blind but also doesn't know how to cherish her. Kennedy smiled. You care too much about this matter. I care about Auntie Samantha. Maisie turned to look at him. Don't you think she's a very good woman? Kennedy stopped for a split second. Thought of Maisie's purpose of setting up this meal for him and sighed helplessly. Samantha and I aren't what you think we are. She saved my life, and I'm very grateful for her act of kindness. As for our relationship, we're only friends. Maisie placed her hands behind her back. Uncle Kennedy, actually. I've always been very curious about the reason you haven't gotten married yet. Kennedy did not say anything. Maisie turned her head. Auntie Samantha is about the same age as you. And I think her personality matches yours very well. I'd feel very happy for you if fate were to bring the both of you together, Uncle Kennedy. Even if Aunt Samantha is divorced and has a son, it doesn't mean that she has no chance of finding happiness in life again. What's more, Uncle Kennedy has a rather refined and sedate temperament. At first glance, he seems to be the type of man who will love his wife. So I'll definitely support it if Aunt Samantha can get together with Uncle Kennedy. Kennedy rubbed her head and said with a helpless tone. You really don't have to get yourself involved in this matter. Maisie wrapped her arm around his. All right, then I won't get my hands in this matter. However, Auntie Samantha is a really good woman. It would be a pity if you were to let her slip past. Chapter 732. At the nursing home. Water droplets dripped off the eaves and onto the leaves of a potted plant sitting on the windowsill. Anthony sat on the couch, flipping through a photo album and feeling extremely melancholic. His daughter had been hurt and had fallen into a long coma. He had been guarding her for a decade and had no idea how long this would last. Lewis stood at the door and knocked on the door, which caused Anthony to put the album down. "Who are you?" he asked in a hoarse voice. "My name is Louis Lucas." "Mr. Lucas?" Anthony was a little bewildered. "Why would you come to me, Mr. Lucas?" Lewis glanced at the person lying on the bed and explained, "I've come here today with someone else." Anthony did not understand what he meant, so he only stood in place and watched as Lewis asked his bodyguard to bring the person in. It was an old man in his 60s whom he did not know. Anthony asked, "This is?" Lewis replied, "He used to be a security guard of the University of Northway, but he's currently retired. He knows about your daughter's incident." Anthony stood up and looked at the old man. "Do you really know?" The old man's shoulders trembled as he explained, I can't remember everything very clearly, but I still remember that incident you're talking about." Lewis placed his hand on his shoulder. "Don't worry, sir. Just tell us what you saw back then." The old man swallowed a mouthful of saliva and nodded. "I remember it was 10 years ago. I saw two young girls arguing behind the performance hall. However, I was too far away from them, and I didn't know what they were arguing about. I was about to approach them when I saw," Anthony interrupted him and asked immediately, "What did you see?" "I saw one of the girls pick something up and use it to hit the head of the other girl. The girl didn't move at all after collapsing on the floor. I was shocked and went to look for the professor in charge." The old man said that the two girls had disappeared from the scene when he brought the professor there and that there was no blood on the floor, so he thought he was mistaken. He had seen the girl collapse on the floor. But she was already gone when he came back to the scene. That professor had thought he was driveling and did not believe him until when a student told them that someone had gotten pushed down the stairs, and they went to the entrance on the second floor. Anthony sat on the couch in a daze. Recalled his daughter's diagnosis back then, which showed that she was suffering from a severe head injury, and thought of the old man's words. He then thought of something, took a photo out of the album, and showed it to the old man. "Please take a good look at this photo. Is this girl the victim who got beaten back then?" The old man stared at the photo for a long time. Because he had witnessed the incident with his own eyes and had been deeply scarred, he would even have nightmares from time to time. He then nodded repeatedly. "Yes, yes, yes. It's her." Anthony asked immediately, "Do you still remember who was the girl who committed the crime?" The old man shook his head. "That I really don't know. Her back was facing me, and I didn't see her face." Lewis looked at the old man and asked intriguingly, "Since you still have some impression of those two girls, you should be able to recall their respective heights, shouldn't you?" The man replied, "Both of them are about the same height." The statement was enough to prove that Riley was not the culprit. Riley was not as tall as Maisie. She was a petite woman, while Naomi was around 5 feet 5 inches. The old man was an eyewitness to that incident. If the two girls were of about the same height, it showed that the other party looked very similar to Naomi in terms of height. Anthony pondered for a moment. "Then why didn't you come forward and tell me this back then?" The old man explained in a panic, "I said it, but they didn't believe me. I was stunned after seeing the face of the girl lying underneath the staircase. They later claimed that they had found the culprit. And I didn't doubt that statement." Chapter 733. Lewis narrowed his eyes. This old man witnessed that scene and saw Naomi's face, but did not see the perpetrator's appearance. So he didn't know anything when Riley was being framed as the perpetrator. Lewis then asked the bodyguard to escort the old man out and stood in front of Anthony. "Mr. Topaz, Riley isn't the culprit who harmed your daughter. She lost all her achievements in the music field that she took pride in because of your daughter. As for the real culprit behind your daughter's incident, I'll locate them for you. All I ask is that you give Riley a chance." Anthony made a remark about Riley and Naomi's incident on Twitter 2 days later. #Riley Hill is not the perpetrator of the accident that took place at the University of Northway 10 years ago. Anthony was the father of the victim, Naomi Topaz. That was why many netizens were surprised when the statement was posted. #Miss Hill actually carried the blame for 10 full years. That's so sad. I've heard about the incident that took place at the University of Northway. I thought it was a rumor back then. Nobody has clarified throughout the decade, so why would it be clarified all of a sudden? The netizens stirred up public opinion, and most of them sympathized with Riley. It was very unfortunate that she had to take the blame and be misunderstood for 10 whole years. She had even been forced into quitting her studies back then. At the Goldman mansion, Maisie looked at those messages in the group chat that tagged Riley. Most of them were only sent to the group to gossip. However, Riley ignored all of them this time around, as playing dead was the wisest thing that she could do at this moment. It was all old news, so it was time to move on now that Riley had been proven innocent. Maisie leaned on Nolan, who was drinking coffee and flipping through the finance magazine in his hand. Nolan turned his head to look at the person sitting next to him. Are you happy now that your best friend has been proven innocent? Maisie chuckled. Yeah. Nolan placed the cup on the table and wrapped his arms around her. I'll be on leave the day after tomorrow. She stopped what she was doing for a split second, got up, and looked at him. The day after tomorrow? Nolan raised his eyebrows. I saw the weather forecast. The temperature will start to get cold the day after tomorrow, making it suitable for a trip to the hot springs. But Uncle Kennedy hasn't recovered yet. If I were to leave the company behind just like this, Maisie felt sorry for her company's employees. Nolan took her into his arms and rested his chin on her head. It's not advisable for your company to only have you and Kennedy as its only 2 top executives. Maisie teased, then will you recruit more talented people for my company? Nolan looked at her, pressed his lips against her forehead, and asked half-jokingly, then do you think I'm qualified enough for your company? Maisie chuckled. Which position do you plan to recommend yourself for? Nolan kissed her. I don't mind becoming the toy boy you keep in your company. She burst into laughter. You're no longer qualified to become my toy boy. You can at most apply to become my toy geezer. Nolan pulled her into his arms and buried his face in her neck. It's no big deal. I might be mature mentally, but I have a teenager's physique. I'll still be able to satisfy you even when you're in your 30s or 40s. A phone's ringtone interrupted the two of them, and Nolan's expression dimmed, looking obviously dissatisfied. Maisie cleared her throat out of awkwardness, and pushed his chest that was pressing against hers gently. Picked up the phone, and took a glance at its screen. It was a call from Riley. She answered the call, and that was when Riley's voice sounded. Z, save me. Maisie's complexion changed instantly. Riley. She heard something. But the call seemed to have been forcibly hung up before Riley could finish speaking. Nolan frowned. What's wrong? Maisie got up in a hurry. Riley seems to have run into some trouble. She called back to the number, but the phone had been turned off. Nolan stood up. Don't panic. Did she tell you where she is? No, she did say something at the end of the call, but I couldn't hear her clearly before the call ended. How can I not be in a panic? Something must have happened to Riley. Chapter 734. Nolan grabbed her by her shoulders. Don't worry. Give me her number, and I'll locate her as you call Quincy for me. Maisie nodded. She contacted Quincy and Lewis while Nolan sat on the side and pinpointed Riley's location in an instant using the computer. She's on Bridgeton Street. At Bridgeton Street. Riley was woken up with a bucket of cold water that was poured onto her head. Half of her coat was soaked, and it was sticking to her body, causing her to feel bitterly cold. She coughed a few times and subconsciously realized that her hands were tied behind her back and could not move. "You've woken up." A slightly familiar voice stunned her, and because it was too cold, she trembled from head to toe as she opened her eyelids. The woman standing in front of her turned out to be Chenny. Riley's voice sounded hoarse, and she looked around immediately. It looked like an undecorated commercial building. The walls were only layered with a layer of cement. The steel bars were clearly visible through the holes of the walls, and the huge and panel-less French windows were dangling outside of the building. The wind got in through the windows, causing Riley to feel so cold that her teeth started chattering. "Chenny. Why is it you?" Chenny looked at her expressionlessly. "Why is it me?" "Actually, I didn't want to do so either." Riley was astonished. "What does she mean?" Chenny squatted down and pinched her jaw. "Do you know how hard and for how long I had worked to secure the spot back then?" Riley froze. Her lips turned pale, and she gnashed her lips and teeth. "It was you. I didn't believe it before this. I even thought that it shouldn't be her." Chenny sneered. "I'm left with no other choice. Mr. Lucas has found out what I did. Even Naomi's father has clarified the matter for you. You have carried the blame for 10 years, so why couldn't you continue carrying it?" "Chenny, I didn't think it was you." Riley's face turned pale. Chenny let go of her hand and stood up. "You and Naomi were the two who had the best grades back then, so the spot would only be given to either one of you. As such, I thought about what I could do in order to secure the spot. Do you know that I even went to Naomi and tried to talk her into working with me to drag you down? I told her that I'd compete with her fairly after you were eliminated from the competition. However, she wasn't willing to do so. She thought that I wasn't competent enough to go head-to-head with her, and you were the only one who could provide her with a decent challenge." Chenny scoffed. "So I could only eliminate Naomi from the equation first and then pin the whole incident on you. It was a plan that killed two birds with one stone, as it made everyone think that you did so because you were competing for the quota. That was why I got the quota instead in the end." Riley only felt colder and colder. "So, what do you want to do?" "What do I want to do?" Chenny looked at her grimly. "Aren't you Mr. Lucas' fiancé? Since he won't let me go, and I can't do anything to him, I can only lay my fingers on you." Riley's expression changed slightly, and it instantly turned as pallid as a sheet of paper. Chenny laughed again. "He'll definitely not do anything to me as long as I have something on you, and he still cares about his fiancé's reputation." "Chenny Campbell," Riley uttered with difficulty. "I've never thought about teaching at the Academy of Music, nor have I ever thought about taking your current achievements away from you. What would all this bullshit help resolve now?" Chenny roared. Riley stopped breathing for a couple of seconds, obviously astounded by her. Her eyes were bloodshot. "The both of you now know everything that you shouldn't know. Will you let this slide and let me off?" "Heh, I'm no fool." She then looked at the men standing behind her. "Why are you still standing over there? Take off her clothes." Those men walked toward Riley while the latter leaned backward subconsciously. "What do you think you're doing? Don't touch me." Chapter 735. Riley was extremely uncooperative. She struggled and resisted even after she was pushed to the ground. She even bit a man's hand, causing him to fling her off his hand in pain and then slap her on the cheek. Riley's head turned to the side, and her wet hair was stuck on her cheek. The buttons of her coat were torn off forcibly, and the close-fitting blouse inside was also torn widely open. Riley was petrified and started to cry in fear. Chenny took out her cell phone to film the scene and ordered the men, "Take everything off of her." One of the men was about to reach out and peel off the only piece of clothing that Riley had left. At that moment, someone kicked the door down, rushed forward, kicked the man on top of her off her body, and punched the other two with a right hook. Chenny was so frightened that she stepped back. Lewis quickly took off his coat, wrapped it around Riley's cold body, and picked her up. Riley. Riley's consciousness was a little blurry as she took a better look at the person who was holding her in his arms. She then started crying. Lewis, I'm so scared. She was shaking all over, cold, and terrified, so she could not stop crying when she saw Lewis. Lewis did not say anything. He hugged her tightly, lifted his head expressionlessly, and then glared at Chenny gloomily. Chenny was startled. However, upon thinking that he was the only one who had come, Chenny said anxiously, "What are you people doing? Are you telling me that you guys can't beat him?" Those men assaulted Lewis, so Lewis put Riley down, dashed up to them, and fought them by himself. The man who had been knocked to the ground grabbed a rebar that was lying around the area and swung it at Lewis vigorously. Lewis not only had to guard himself against the attack coming from the people behind him, but he also had to avoid the rebar and the attack from the people who were coming at him from the side simultaneously. He swung out his left leg and kicked the man coming at him from the left in his abdomen, but he was then caught off guard and got hit by the rebar in the back. He staggered forward, then turned around and punched the man in the chin with an uppercut. Looking at how the fight panned out, Chenny froze in place due to fear, and her expression paled. Those henchmen were not professional fighters, but neither was Lewis. All they relied on was their brawn and ruthlessness as both parties struggled during the fight. Riley witnessed the rebar hitting Lewis a few times, and her heart was racing. She then shouted hoarsely, "Be careful." Two of the men worked together to capture Lewis and limit his movement. And another man hit Lewis's face with the rebar. Lewis was caught off guard and collapsed on the ground with crimson blood gushing out of his nostrils and oozing out of the corners of his lips. His vision began to turn blurry, to a point where he started seeing dazzling images. Riley's voice stopped abruptly when Lewis was beaten down to the ground. Lewis was crawling on the ground at this moment, looking extremely battered. His charming and handsome face was wounded, and his clothes were stained with dirt and his own blood. Just as the man was swinging his rebar and was about to hit him on the head, a swift shadow stepped forward in an instant and kicked the man 16 feet away from Lucas. Sadie swept the man beside her off his feet, grabbed the man by his elbow, and pulled his arm backward, dislocating his shoulder in an instant. The man shouted in pain when Quincy, Nolan, and Maisie arrived at the scene. Maisie saw Riley and hurried over to hug her. Riley. Z. Riley curled herself in her arms and wept in a low voice, "You're finally here." Quincy helped Lewis, who was badly injured and coughing up blood, back onto his feet. Nolan said sullenly, "Take them both out first." Quincy nodded. Maisie left Riley with the bodyguard, who picked Riley up into his arms and left with Quincy. It took only a few seconds for Sadie to beat the men to a pulp on the ground, unable to move. Chenny was hiding behind the wall, trying to climb out of the building before anyone found her. However, a rebar appeared in front of her face abruptly. Sadie looked down at her condescendingly. "Are you planning to leave already?" Chenny knelt on the ground and trembled in fright. "Please let me go, Chapter 736. Sadie dragged her by her hair to Nolan. She was still kneeling on the floor. After seeing what happened to the men, her face was white as a sheet. Maisie picked up the phone that was not far from her and saw the paused video, threw it to the ground, and crushed the screen with her heel. "Please. Please let me go. I won't do it again." Channy held back tears and looked extremely sincere while she begged. Maisie didn't show any expressions when she pulled at her collar. "Let you go? Not a chance." Channy's expression slowly turned to horror. Maisie scoffed. "You made Riley a scapegoat for a decade and even tried to attack her. Would you let Riley go if she begged you?" She couldn't answer. Maisie coldly said, "Whatever a woman like you achieved by framing someone else doesn't belong to you because you don't deserve it." She let go, and Chenny fell back onto the ground. The police rushed to the scene, and Nolan said something to a police officer. They then took the person sitting on the floor away. Cheney was taken away by the police, while the police officer spoke to Nolan on one side. He just took a statement and took her away. After that, Maisie stood on the spot and stared while the police car drove away, her hands curling into a fist. Nolan pulled her into his arms and spoke to her gently, which made her a lot more relaxed. Maisie blamed herself. If we got here later, I don't want to imagine what could have happened. Nolan flexed his arm and held her tighter. It's all right now. Didn't we get here on time? Maisie leaned in his arms and said, was I very fierce just now? She had almost assaulted her. Nolan kissed the top of her head and chuckled. Were you fierce? You were like a ferocious kitten. Maisie looked at him. Let's go to the hospital. He nodded. Quincy brought Lewis and Riley to the hospital, and Maisie and Nolan got there soon after. Quincy waited outside. She rushed forward and asked, how are they? Quincy replied, Mr. Lucas was more hurt, but Ms. Hill is fine. She was just shocked and has a fever. Nolan hugged her. Go see Riley. Maisie nodded and walked toward Riley's room. Riley lay in bed looking pale and didn't have a lot of energy because of her fever. She saw Maisie sitting next to the bed and pouted. Z, did I ugly cry? Maisie laughed. Do you really care if you ugly cried? Riley looked at the ceiling for a long time. How's Cheney? Maisie stopped smiling. She'll get what's coming for her. This combined with Naomi's incident, she's definitely going to do some time. Riley sighed. I didn't expect it to be her. She then remembered something, turned around, and asked, by the way, how is Lewis? Maisie raised her brow. You finally care about him now? Riley lowered her gaze. He was hurt because he wanted to save me. I can't just forget it. Maisie smiled but didn't say anything. Riley continued. Don't let my dad find out. I don't want him to be sad. Maisie nodded. Larissa found out that Lewis was admitted to the hospital. She rushed there and bumped into Maisie in the corridor. Z, Larissa rushed toward her. What exactly happened? Maisie told her everything, which made Larissa frown. That's absurd. How could she do that to my daughter-in-law? Chapter 737. Maisie said, Aunt Larissa, don't be angry. They've been taken away by the police. Lewis and Riley are fine too. Thank goodness. I was worried to death. I'll go see how Lewis is. Larissa walked toward Lewis's room. Nolan came to pick Maisie up. And Maisie kept her eyes on the view outside on the way back. Nolan held her hand. Are you still worried? Maisie looked back at him. They're fine, so I have nothing to worry about anymore. Z. Do you know what Riley and Lewis's encounter reminds me of? Maisie quietly looked at him and didn't say a thing. He focused on driving and kept his eyes on the road. I seem to remember. Did we go through something like this? It feels familiar. Maisie looked down and smiled. Yes. We did. When they stopped at the traffic light, Nolan pulled her hand and kissed its back. I'll slowly remember, so we'll start our honeymoon tomorrow and spend some time alone. The next day. At Bassburg Airport. Nolan was sitting at the business boarding lounge with his arms crossed when he saw Helios and his assistant sitting across from him. He looked very gloomy. On the other side of the spectrum, Helios wore a maroon coat with an upturned collar, which made him look really bright and warm. He looked at Nolan and raised his eyebrow. What a coincidence. Nolan scoffed. It really is. Maisie held her forehead. Helios was just going to Winston Island for a holiday, and they had bumped into each other. But what was with this hostility? Are you going to Winston Island with Nolan? Helios looked toward Maisie, who nodded. Yes, for a few days. Nolan put his arms around her and looked at him. I'm going for my honeymoon with my wife. Why are you going there? Do you have a wife? Maisie stared at Nolan. This 17-year-old is in full view, before Helios. Helios smiled. Do I need to tell you that? Flight toward Winston Island MH8896 will be taking off in half an hour. Please get ready to board. When the announcement started, the travelers started walking to the counter to start their boarding. Nolan and Maisie were in first-class seats, so they got to board the earliest. When they took their seats, they saw Helios and his assistant sitting in front of them on the other side. Maisie nodded to them. And Helios looked up before nodding and smiling. Then his eyes caught Nolan's. It only took 2 hours to get to Winston Island, so it was quite nearby. Winston Island was a standalone island, a place that was famous for its hot springs. The weather there was unpredictable. It could be sunny during daytime and very cold at night. The hot spring business thrived on the island because travelers would book hotels with hot springs there during winter. Maisie hadn't slept well the night before, so she lay her head on Nolan's shoulder to rest. Nolan got a blanket from the air hostess and gently put it over Maisie. Nolan only woke her up when the plane landed at Winston Island Airport. They both got off the plane, and when Nolan saw her yawning, he hugged her waist and smiled. Are you very tired? Yes, I didn't sleep well last night. After Maisie said that, she stared at him. All because of you. Nolan chuckled. They got to the hot spring hotel with a sea view and checked in. They booked a room with a 360 degrees view and sensors. Chapter 738. The blind slowly opened, and one could see the blue sea from the room. Maisie walked into the bedroom, which had a private garden. There were folding chairs with cushioning under the sun umbrella and even a swing. Nolan unbuttoned his sleeves and leaned on the door. Do you like it? Maisie walked to the swing and sat down. You're good at picking places. Nolan walked behind her and bent down to hug her by the shoulders while saying in her ear, It's our time alone. It should be romantic. In the afternoon, they both went to the restaurant. Maisie had changed into a bubble-sleeved dress in silk with a vest on top, her skirt covering her calf. It was a huge coincidence, but they bumped into Helios dining there as well. Helios raised his glass and smiled at them. If you don't mind. Let's dine together? Maisie was fine with it because they knew each other. Sure. She took a seat. Nolan sat down unwillingly and raised his brows. You're not following us, I hope? Helios smiled. Why would I follow you? Have you not seen the billboard for this hot spring resort? Maisie paused, then looked around, her eyes fixed on the QLED television fixed on the wall. Helios was endorsing this resort. Nolan kept quiet. He hadn't noticed that. That was a mistake. Maisie looked at Helios in awe. Mr. Boucher, you've been to this island before? Helios nodded. A year ago. Oh. Maisie suddenly remembered something. By the way, where's your assistant? She had motion sickness and didn't feel like eating, so she's resting in her room. Nolan watched them having a conversation. And his face started dropping. He finally had the chance to spend time alone with his wife, yet this third wheel appeared to interrupt them. Nolan removed the shells of the seafood during the meal. Maisie was chatting with Helios, and when she noticed, her plate was already full of food. Her mouth twitched. Nolan, I can't eat that much. Does he think he's feeding a pig? Nolan smiled. I was worried that it wasn't enough to stuff your mouth. Maisie was silent. Helios smiled. You're so anxious now. You weren't like this before. Nolan stared into his eyes. Are we going to bring up the past again? Helios swirled his glass, then grinned. Not if you don't want to. Nolan agreed. You should shut up. Maisie focused on eating her food. These two childish men, Mr. Boucher. Are you here on vacation? Maisie felt that he wouldn't just be there for vacation. It was either for work or something else. Nolan pinched her face. Why do you care about him so much? Maisie slapped his hand away. My dear. Can you be less jealous? Nolan didn't retort because she called him dear and stopped speaking. Helios put down his wine glass. I'm really not here just for vacation. I came because of an investment. Nolan looked at him. You're moving from entertainment to business now? Helios rolled his eyes. It depends if there's a business that's worth my time. I heard that this is the peak season for hot spring tourism here. I plan to invest. Maisie put her hand under her chin. The hot spring industry is quite good. If the Vanderbilts invested some money here, they wouldn't have gone bankrupt. Chapter 739. The hot spring tourism industry wasn't as good in Karelia as on Winston Island. That was mainly because the sea and hills surrounded the island, and it was toward the south, so it wouldn't snow even in winter. Karelia's weather was different. It would snow there in winter. And the roads would freeze at its coldest, making it difficult for people and cars to move. Most people would travel there just to see snow, but no one would want to revisit after being bullied by the snow on the way there. Nolan put down the seafood cracker, wiped his fingers with a napkin, and looked at Helios. Why don't I remember you being interested in this industry? Helios looked down, tapping his fingers on the glass. My family is pressuring me. I haven't reached their standard to start my own family other than for my career in the entertainment industry. You want to leave the family? Maisie was shocked. Wouldn't that mean they were splitting up? A big family like the Bouchers had never split up. Furthermore, Elder Master Boucher thought highly of Helios, and he was the eldest grandchild. He would become the head of the house in the future. But once they split, it would be very different. He would have to move out and start his own family, which meant he would be giving up inheriting the Boucher family. Helios didn't even hesitate, his eyes calm. At least I can do what I want and not follow all the Boucher rules. Maisie was quiet. She remembered what Helios had said. He was jealous of Nolan because he didn't have restrictions and could do whatever he wanted. But it was different for Helios. He had broken the precedent by getting into the entertainment industry. After lunch, Maisie brought Nolan to a theme park nearby. She turned around and looked at Nolan, who was zoning out, and got close. Are you still angry? Nolan hugged her shoulder and looked down at her. Why would I be? Maisie raised her hand to soothe the wrinkles between his brows, raised her brows, and smiled. Weren't you close with Helios since you were kids? Why are you so jealous? Nolan held her hand. I just don't like him. Was it because your mother treated him better than her own son? Maisie suddenly realized that she was bringing in unrelated topics. Maisie turned to look at the theme park that was not far away, filled with people, and changed the subject. Let's do that ride. She pointed at the pirate ship that way hanging in the air. Nolan raised his brows. You're not afraid? Don't underestimate me. I'm afraid of nothing. Maisie pulled his hand and entered the park. After the pirate ship, Maisie dragged Nolan to the roller coaster. Nolan just went with it, his expression never changing, even on the most exciting twists and turns. Maisie was annoyed when they got the pictures and jabbed her elbow into his waist. Can't you just show some fear? Nolan looked proud. No. What else would you want to try? Maisie saw something and tugged at Nolan's arm, the haunted house. Most people who went there were couples. They walked into the dimly lit haunted house with a flashlight, and people could hear the scared couples being afraid. Human NPCs would randomly jump out along with some lifelike props, scaring everyone half to death. Maisie jumped now and then and hugged Nolan, not letting go. Nolan hugged her calmly, and when an NPC got close, he scared that person away. They got out after half an hour, and the crew was surprised. The couples who escaped never looked as calm as Nolan, hugging his girlfriend. Some people even left their girlfriends and broke up right after that. Chapter 740. Maisie buried her face in his shoulder. It was too embarrassing. Nolan put her down on a bench, put his hand on the backrest behind her, and seemed to want more. Do you want to continue? Maisie had been scared so badly in the haunted house that her tears were still in her eyes, looking very delicate. She said, no more. Nolan laughed and gently wiped the tear off the corner of her eyes. Maisie can be afraid sometimes. She hummed and turned away, looking at the Ferris wheel far away. He noticed that. Do you want to ride that? Maisie nodded. Nolan brought her to the bottom of the Ferris wheel, paid, and walked into a cabin. The cabin slowly moved upward while Maisie looked out and smiled with joy. My first Ferris wheel ride was in Staslo. Nolan looked at her, and something flashed across his mind while they rose higher. Maisie kept her eyes on the view outside. Riding on a Ferris wheel during daytime and slowly moving upward, she could see far away. Even the sea that connected with the horizon. The sea looked like a silver veil under the sun, the waves gleaming. The people on the ground looked so small, and half the Winston Island town was in view. When Maisie started zoning out, Nolan suddenly got up. She turned around and saw a huge face with clear features, then her lips were warm and wet, and time froze. Nolan held the back of her head with his hand and kissed her deeper. When their cabin reached the top, the light warmly shone through the glass window, and pink bubbles surrounded them. Nolan let her go after a long while. Maisie was stunned, her cheeks still warm. Nolan, do you know what it means to be kissed on a Ferris wheel? Nolan touched her face with his palm and looked at her. I guess it's something good. Maisie thought he remembered but was disappointed when she heard that reply. She sat back in her seat, crossed her arms, and started being serious. If we kiss on the Ferris wheel, it means that you can only belong to me from now on. Nolan tried to hide his smile. Really? Maisie pretended to be angry. Why? You don't want that? Nolan got close, kissed her, and sneakily smiled. Let's kiss a few more times then. Maisie closed her eyes as his lips came close again. And her hand that was on her shoulder moved backward to hug him. Back in Bassburg, at the hospital. Z and her husband are having their honeymoon in Winston Island. But you're enjoying 4 drips in the hospital with your fiancé. Riley was having an apple when Barbara said that and laughed till her tears came out. She got annoyed. Are you here to visit me or to laugh at me? Barbara stifled her laugh. Of course I'm here to visit you. Riley took a huge bite out of her apple, then Barbara thought of something and said, I bumped into Zyla on the way here. Riley paused and looked at Barbara. That's not surprising. There's nothing wrong if an ex-girlfriend visits her ex-boyfriend who's injured. It's not surprising, Barbara leaned on the wall, but you're Lewis's fiancé. It's not great if your fiancé still can't get over his ex. Riley slammed the apple on the table. It's not bad. The families, not ourselves, decided my marriage with Lewis. I smell something. What?